Hey, everybody. Hope you're doing well and that you had a wonderful weekend. Welcome back. We are locked and loaded. We're talking about political institutions, and institutions are, after all, the subject of this course, but the democratic ones are different than other types. Before we get to those democratic institutions, we're going to finish our discussion of the basics and what institutions are and the kinds of differences that become important when we study regimes and other topics in comparative politics. So this will involve a little bit of contribution from you and some engagement here and there. But I do have a presentation as before, and eventually I'll incorporate you, but I'd like you to continue to involve yourself and ask questions and just be a part of it, be here for it. We had a good discussion last time, and I'm sure that we will again. So thanks for being here. Let's go ahead and get started. Just some housekeeping before we do. You'll notice that I've posted all of the readings, and I've also posted the lecture slides from last week and a link to a YouTube video, a recording of the Friday lecture. So you'll find all of that stuff updated periodically, and that's available on CAT courses. So I'm sure that will be useful to many of you who may want to review the lecture, or some of you who may not be able to attend from time to time can also review stuff as well. So we are discussing institutions and institutional variation. And now that we've talked about what institutions are, they are the rules of the game, the organization of society, and they shape the incentives of political leaders and they shape the distribution of political power. Now that we know what these things are, we take the next step, which is to acknowledge that there are huge differences in institutions across and within countries. Countries are very, very different in terms of the way they organize their political system. Some are obviously democracies, some are dictatorships. Some societies have very tight limits on the exercise of presidential power. Others give presidents extensive authority at the expense of other institutions. Some dictatorships don't even have other institutions, and the president is the only actor. Societies differ in terms of their electoral rules. Some have, of course, single member districts and majoritarian systems like the United States. Others have proportional representation systems like much of Europe. Legal systems are also very, very different. Some legal systems have a scriptural or a religious basis, as in Saudi Arabia. Other legal systems are completely secular and are supposed to be inspired by a clear separation of church and state and an establishment of public authority and rulemaking through the courts and through legislative and political institutions. So like, the United States, which is founded on this firm separation of the church and the state, the legal system being affected and shaped by that separation as well. Then there are differences in norms around corruption and behavior of public officials. In some countries, it's relatively acceptable to engage in corruption and it's part of doing business and it becomes part of politics. In other countries, there are very tight limits on corruption and it can be very disastrous if you get caught engaging in corruption. Let's take a look at some examples of some very sharp institutional differences. The two Koreas are a good example of the difference between democracy and dictatorship. South Korea is a parliamentary democracy. It's actually a presidential democracy, excuse me, but it's a robust, developed democracy where competitive elections decide who makes decisions that affect everyone and where power is dispersed relatively broadly in the assembly, the South Korean assembly. In North Korea, on the other hand, the North Korean political elite basically includes these five people. There is, of course, the dictator. There are then the military generals who form the sort of inner circle or support circle for that totalitarian regime. The difference couldn't be any more striking. This is a difference between democracy and dictatorship an institutional difference, a difference in the way in which society is organized. But these two countries otherwise began at essentially the same place in the 1950s when they separated and went their separate ways. We could look at the example of corruption in post Soviet countries. It's well known that Russia is a very corrupt country. In fact, one of the reasons that the Russian economy has been crisis prone is because in the 90s, when they sold off their state assets and enterprises, oligarchs and very rich people who were closely connected to the elite were the ones who were able to buy up those state enterprises at very, very low costs. And it distorted competition and it got the society off on a bad foot, so to speak. Many people argue that the corruption in Russia continues to drag down economic growth and that it also affects politics for obvious reasons. But Estonia is an example of a post-Soviet country that is not corrupt at all. And in fact, where they have significantly reduced corruption through the setting up of anti-corruption boards and other institutions. Things like the privatization of state enterprises and the selling of them to oligarchs is unimaginable in Estonia. But these are two countries that are otherwise relatively similar in that they had a similar starting point. The point that I want to make to you is that these formal and informal institutions can vary radically from country to country, even if the countries are relatively similar and even if they had similar starting points. And another example of this is the change in Turkey from a parliamentary democracy to a essentially sort of authoritarian presidential democracy where the legislature has a significantly reduced role in where the president and specifically Erdogan is very much empowered to make decisions independently and without the input or the deliberation of the assembly. This is a transformation in Turkey in a switch from more sort of representative institutions to more power concentrating institutions. These are all examples of variation from one period to another or from country to country in institutions. These are the kinds of differences that become very, very important to an institutionalist. In a class like this is sort of our starting point. The observation that institutions exist and that they vary considerably across space, as well as across time in many situations too. These differences become very useful to us because we want to understand systematically why institutions vary. And we can then study these countries and compare them in order to try to understand in a rigorous way what accounts for the differences in why the institutions vary and how they impact politics differently. So these are some examples that help to set the stage for a lot of what we do in the class. Now, before we continue, let me take a look at where we are with the chat. Yes, Maximus, they just arrested an opposition leader to Putin. Not just that, there were huge protests in opposition to, I think, a move to jail Navalny when he arrived and returned to Russia. Navalny was the opposition figure. There were huge protests, and they arrested more than 3,000 people who were protesting the arrest of Navalny. Navalny being the opposition leader who was persecuted by the state. And so that gives you a taste of what it's like in Russia. And again, we talk about the incentives that institutions create. When you have what is essentially an authoritarian system, political leaders have an incentive to kill off their opposition. Because the rules of the game, in the way that the system works, coercion has an important role to play because of the absence of competitive elections. Classic Putin indeed. Yeah, Russia is the same place where opponents of the regime like mysteriously fall off balconies like all the time. You know, they mysteriously die in like their bathtub, you know, just stuff that just happens, you know, all the time, right? I'm being, of course, sarcastic, but But Jeffrey says North Korea does have a legislature as well. This is called the contemporary dictatorship. Yeah, I mean, it's just a rubber stamp. It's all for show. Oftentimes authoritarian regimes try to legitimate themselves by setting up facade and sham institutions, and sometimes they'll even try to use them quite regularly, and they'll try to have elections on a regular basis. Some authoritarian regimes actually have more elections than democracies. They're all rigged, of course, but you see the point. Efren says, what can you say about the constitutional crisis that occurred with the 45th president? Does this apply to this issue? Well, Efren, the question there, I think, is, what does the crisis say about the strength or the durability of the institutions? A crisis tests the durability of institutions. It's always an inflection point. Will the arrangement survive, or will there be a transition to some sort of other type of set of practices? Maybe a transition from a democratic to a more authoritarian type of politics. I think that what the crisis here in this country says is that the effective resolution of the crisis demonstrates the durability of the institutions, and the constitutional order does remain intact. I think that it remains weathered, and the extent to which participants in US politics adhere to those rules is increasingly in question, but they do still rule the day. So the question of the crisis and what it says, I think it says that there are some weaknesses, and maybe more generally, the system might be inspiring a loss of confidence in ordinary citizens. But for now, we still have a constitutional order that remains intact. Christopher says, who is compiling this data to analyze? Which data are you referring to, Christopher? I'm not sure.
You were saying that we can now study, where is the data coming from? Is it like from different educational institutions around the world? Is it just from America? Is it just from the UK? Is it just from the UK and America?
What was I
Like,
saying that in reference to?
like how we're studying, how we can now study these different institutions. Who's studying them? Is it just the universities of California? Is it the East Coast universities? Is it maybe other universities in the world? Like
Well,
where
there's
does
a
the data come from?
well, there's a very long tradition of institutional analysis, and in fact, this class is rooted in what we would call the new institutionalism, which is a new literature that built on what was previously called the old institutionalism. And so this is something that people throughout the world have studied. And so the literatures that we read are pulling insights and knowledge from all of this that's taken place everywhere for really more than 100 years. And so the March and Olson piece that I had you read summarizes a lot of that knowledge, and they refer to this new institutionalism as I've also referred to it. And so when I say we can study it, what I mean is that in a situation like Turkey, we can compare Turkey before and after the constitutional reform. And so we can try to understand how that change came about, what drove the institutional change, and then how it becomes consequential. And when I said, for example, we can now study the two Koreas, or we can now study the Soviet countries, what I mean is South Korea and North Korea parted ways in the 1950s. It's been more than half a century since they went separate ways. And so when I say we can now study the impact, well, we can look at the two countries and say, well, how did the different choices they made with regard to institutions, how did those choices affect their development? Is South Korea more developed or less so as a result of adopting democracy and market economics, et cetera? How was North Korea affected by choosing authoritarian rule, and so on? And so time gives us the advantage of being able to study it in the same way that we can compare the Soviet countries too. And so when I say we, I mean everyone who's doing this, everyone in this enterprise who's studying institutions, be they democratic or otherwise. So it's not just us, it's not just the University of California, it's an entire academic community of scholars, thousands, tens of thousands of people studying these issues. So going to go back to the chat here and consult the chat. Trying to be a dictator is just about as close as being a dictator as you can get without being one. Touche. Jake said, the reading for last week said, and I'm paraphrasing here, something about institutions aren't inevitable. And I found that really interesting because I think our institutions are something that maybe some of us take for granted. And the attack on the Capitol at the beginning of the month kind of highlighted that point. Yeah, they're not inevitable because we make choices about which ones to adopt and which ones not to adopt. We create them. They don't build themselves, and so they're imbued with the circumstances of their creation. And moreover, we do take them for granted. As I pointed out in the lecture last week on Friday, one of the characteristics of an institution is that we value them for their own sake. They sort of take on a life of their own almost. We forget that they don't just exist of their own accord, that we've created them. But when we create them, we construct them at a time and at a given place. And so, as I'll show you in a moment, the creation is often a specific moment with specific circumstances and power relations and ideas that influence and inspire their creation. And so they are things that we create and they don't just emerge out of anywhere. He did not have any traits of being a dictator. The way the left portrayed him was horrible. Trump did not call his followers to attack the Capitol. He literally did. He incited the riot. I just disagree. And he, from the beginning, aspired to be a dictator. He tried to overturn the results of a valid election. Yeah, and so I don't think we need to litigate this. He absolutely aspired to be a dictator. So let's discuss the case of institutional variation in Latin America. This is a question that gets to the heart of one of the key questions and issues related to political institutions, that difference between democracy and dictatorship. And the case of Latin America is interesting because at present, we see a variety of different forms or types of political regime. We see, for instance, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, which are dictatorships, in that the leader or the head of the state was not competitively elected. And then we see 18 other former Spanish or Portuguese colonies that are more or less democratic. These are sharp differences in political institutions. These are differences that become quite important to an institutionalist. And when we look out at the world, an institutionalist would notice these differences first and foremost and think about how they would become consequential and how they might affect other aspects of social life or economic life or political life. And on this question, we begin to address the issue of institutional variation and why institutions might be so different in some countries and so different in others. Why is it that Nicaragua or Guatemala are dictatorships while El Salvador doesn't yet fit that category? Why is Venezuela a dictatorship while Chile or Ecuador are not? Why is Brazil a democracy while Venezuela is not? These are similar countries with different institutions and different political institutions, some democratic, some not being democratic. And the question arises, why do these differences exist and how can we understand them? Why is it that democracy prevails in some countries and doesn't in others? This is just one example of a question that we could ask from an institutionalist perspective if we're interested in understanding institutional variation. And I now want to introduce to you a few different perspectives on institutional variation. And these are three perspectives that we'll be using in this class. This class, of course, will explore democratic institutions and their origins and their functions and the forms they take, but we'll also be assessing the different circumstances that gave rise to institutions in given cases. And so each case is unique, but we can also think of cases in similar ways, and we'll be using these perspectives to do that. So we'll begin by pointing out a school of thought called historical institutionalism. And this is a school of thought that emphasizes the ways that actors create and change institutions to promote their own interests and to promote their own power. And the idea is that there are these critical junctures or these moments in time where the normal constraints on action are lifted. These critical junctures open up all sorts of possibilities for institution creation and institution change because they lift the normal constraints on action and they create possibilities by weakening the defenders of the status quo and strengthening maybe the proponents of an alternative. And at these moments, the power relations and the political ideas that kind of emerge become critical in shaping the institutions that result. And so if you have uneven power relations in political ideas that prefer or promote or highlight or sort of strengthen a certain type of institution, it's likely that those institutions will be created. Whereas the institutions that might be beneficial to those who are weaker at that moment in time would be discarded. And in this way, power relations and ideas become important drivers of institutions at critical junctures. Critical junctures, again, we define as moments where the normal constraints on action are lifted. Now, once institutions get created through power relations and political ideas at these particular moments, they then get reproduced and they get maintained over time through what we call path dependence. Path dependence is a type of development where steps in a given direction make it more difficult to reverse course. Each step that we take in a given direction makes it harder for us to go back to the starting line. The reason is because path dependence creates vested interests, it creates bureaucratic inertia, and it creates cognitive constraints. Now I'll discuss those one by one. Vested interests are benefits enjoyed by certain actors that depend on the perpetuation of the status quo. Whenever we create an institution, it creates benefits for certain actors and costs for certain others. There are winners and there are losers. This is the nature of politics. Path dependence is partly a product of those beneficiaries of the institutions using their gains and using their power that they derive from the status quo to perpetuate the status quo. Bureaucratic inertia is basically tunnel vision. It's when agencies of the state and decision makers are unable to imagine alternatives because they're conditioned by the characteristics of the organization and the institutions of the present. And so basically what happens is they get enmeshed in the status quo and they can't imagine an alternative. And so it then works against change and it helps to maintain the system. Now, cognitive constraints relate to those limitations on alternatives. I actually just defined bureaucratic inertia as cognitive constraints, excuse me. Cognitive constraints are those limitations on imagination that come from the status quo. It becomes difficult to imagine alternatives because of steps in each direction, kind of giving you tunnel vision and making it difficult to see how things might work differently. Bureaucratic inertia is when agencies of the state contract well in advance based on the status quo, which makes it in turn more difficult to change course. Historical institutionalism is all about how actors use their power and use ideas to create and legitimate institutions and then maintain them through periods of stability. And it's an approach that's very, very sensitive to time and sequencing and development across time. Now, rational choice institutionalism, on the other hand, is all about how actors create institutions to resolve their collective action problems and better cooperate and work together. The idea is that power relations aren't really a consideration. Ideas aren't really a consideration either. It's all about finding an equilibrium or finding a sort of set of rules that everyone can kind of coordinate around and cooperate around for mutual benefit. The idea is that we can all get mutual gains from the system if we set up institutions that will help us to resolve any difficulties we have working together. So these collective action problems are made easier by setting up things like money or markets that help us to come together and sort of create expectations and reduce the uncertainty of engaging in exchange or working together to cooperate in a way. So, whereas historical institutionalism is all about power and ideas, rational choice institutionalism is all about cooperation and resolving dilemmas. It's all about instrumentality and calculations of benefit and cost, but more importantly, about collective action problems and how to cooperate and reduce costs given those problems. So rational choice institutionalism is very different, but somewhat similar in that institutions have a function. It's just that they function to benefit many more actors. Now, sociological institutionalism is very, very different than both of these approaches. Sociological institutionalism imagines that organizations and actors are always embedded in social fields or broader kind of communities that have certain expectations about their behavior. In this perspective says that actors and organizations create institutions to enhance their social legitimacy and to make them more legitimate in the eyes of some other group or actor or in some other context or in some other social field. So this is all about what is most appropriate, what is most acceptable or most legitimate from the perspective of this community that we are embedded in. Whereas rational choice institutionalism sees fully informed, sort of calculating decision makers who come together to cooperate on the basis of self interest and cooperation. Sociological institutionalism sees basically script followers, right? People who are, obeying social norms and uh, uh, trying to legitimate their behavior and appear legitimate in the eyes of others who might judge their behavior or judge their practices. So these are very different approaches. Historical institutionalism is about power relations and ideas and time. Rational choice institutionalism is about cooperation in mutual interest and mutual gain in solving collective action problems. Sociological institutionalism is all about social appropriateness and social legitimacy and acceptable behavior in some given society or community. These are different perspectives on what shapes institution creation and what maintains them as well. Before we continue, I want to pause and ask you, do you have any comments or questions about these perspectives? We'll be using these for the rest of the semester, and these also appear in a more limited form in the reading you did by March and Olson for last week. But do you have any comments or questions about these so far?
Professor, can you go over path dependence again or just kind of elaborate on it?
Yeah. So everyone, if you're looking at your computer right now, I'd like you to look down at your keyboard. Look at the first row of letters. Notice it says QWERTY. Does that make any sense? Why would they have done that? Well, do you know why they did that? Because well, the story goes, the economists tell us this at least. When they designed the keyboard, they designed it that way from the start. And as things got developed and designed around the early designs of the keyboard, it became impossible to reverse course and change the order of the letters because they took subsequent steps that made it impossible to reverse course because other technologies were developed around the QWERTY keyboard, the QWERTY. Path dependence captures this exactly. Path dependence can be defined in the following way. It is a pattern of institutional development where each step in a given direction makes it more difficult to reverse course because there is what we call positive feedback that comes from vested interests, bureaucratic inertia, or cognitive constraints. Now, the QWERTY keyboard is an example of both bureaucratic inertia and cognitive constraints, and possibly vested interests too. Once they chose to design it that way, and they made subsequent steps in that direction, developing new technologies around it, they could no longer go back in time and change it. So they're stuck with it. Path dependence works in a similar way. Once we install and create institutions at a given point in time, it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to go back and change them unless we have another critical juncture, unless we have another moment where some shock from outside of the system destabilizes everything and changes everything and creates a window of opportunity for change again. So this is an example of path dependence. And path dependence is useful and necessary to understand how institutions reproduce themselves over time. Hope, they do overlap. You'll notice that historical institutionalism kind of does include some elements of rational choice institutionalism in the sense that those powerful actors who create institutions at certain moments are also probably acting rationally or in a way that they believe is shaped by an assessment of their best interests. They do certainly overlap. And moreover, ideas are also part of sociological institutionalism. And so there's some cross-pollination. I want you to think of these as complementary. You can use these together if you want to highlight different parts of reality. You could also use one over the other if you chose, and if you wanted to make an argument in favor of one perspective at the expense of any of the others. Yes, Maximus, I know that at the top of my head. Justin says, so is that the reason why we never see a different type of keyboard layout or the way it is being built? Exactly, Justin. Yeah, exactly. And it's an amazing story. And it's the best example, I think, of path dependence because it shows that literally, when you develop a technology or an institution, if you will, a practice, and you take subsequent steps, you can't go back because you've taken steps to build on that pattern. And unless you undo everything, you're stuck with what you began with. And so that's why we still have the QWERTY keyboard. Efren says, could path dependence correlate with ideology because some individuals may have difficulty adapting to new approaches of institutions? Without a doubt, Efren, because the ideas that are in place at a critical juncture do influence the continued survival of the institution. Because say it's the post-war period, and we're very inspired by Keynesian ideas that emphasize giving people money so that they can go spend and improve the market and improve the economy. That idea was a very powerful idea during the post-war period. And as a result, they instituted social welfare states in advanced countries. And in subsequent years, even when the post-war period came to an end, the defense and the perpetuation of the welfare state still owed a lot to the survival of those Keynesian ideas. So those ideas become important to the survival of the institution after the idea was important to the creation of it as well. And so ideas can have an important restraining influence. So there certainly is a link between the two. Yeah, the example with the keyboard is super interesting. I always wondered if it was true, but everything I've looked at and everything I've read says that it's exactly what happened. And when you learn about that, it's almost unbelievable, but it makes sense. It makes sense. Would war be a legitimate cause of derailing path dependence? Yes, Hope. And in fact, wars and world wars in particular, as well as civil wars, usually destabilize patterns of path dependence because it weakens many of the traditional defenders of the status quo. It can, and it can strengthen proponents of alternatives. It can, in general, introduce new ideas and kind of reorganize society around new coalitions. This is what we've seen in a lot of places. So war is a good example of precisely this sort of destabilizer or exogenous shock, if you will, that could destabilize a process of path dependence. Jeffrey says, I believe it is, and Jeffrey is correct, especially civil wars. Yes, and it's really interesting on the topic of civil wars. It's been shown, for instance, that civil wars can actually destabilize patterns of path dependence that previously upheld authoritarian regimes. And the reason is because civil wars can often forge new forms of social and collective action in new coalitions. And those can often be marshaled and mobilized in opposition to the survival or the continuation of the dictatorship, either during or once the civil war comes to an end. And so civil war can often be a powerful exogenous shock, even if the sort of incumbent regime is able to win the civil war, so to speak. If the civil war comes to an end, there might be sufficient reorganization of society along opposition lines to bring about the end of the regime in some other way. It's really phenomenal, really interesting. Goes to show you how institutions can become quite sort of cemented, but how they can also be undone by new patterns and new events that shock or destabilize the system. So World War II was probably the best example of an exogenous shock, but the Great Depression was an exogenous shock as well. Global economic crises are examples of exogenous shocks. Earthquakes, like the one in Mexico in the 90s, is an example of an exogenous shock. Or was that 1985? I can't remember. Anyway, that's an example of an exogenous shock. Natural disasters can be examples of exogenous shocks if they expose the weaknesses of the state or the limitations of existing institutions. We can think of other examples, but in general, these sorts of events become really important. What I want you to notice is that these different approaches, these different perspectives, as Hope points out, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive. There's some overlap with them, but you can also use them individually. And this brings me to my next question for you, or my first question, I should say, which is, do you gravitate towards one of these perspectives? Do you think of yourself as more historical in your thinking? Are you more rational choice driven in your thinking, or do you think of these issues in a more sociological way? I would like to see where you sort of think that you kind of fit. It could be that you see value to all of these, but I want to ask you to kind of think in terms of which one you might gravitate to the most. And so let me stop the share here temporarily, and I'm going to launch a poll. All right, everyone, I've launched a poll, and I want to see what you gravitate to and where you kind of picture yourself.
Professor, I have a question.
What's up?
Because I remember also learning last semester as well that sometimes wars can also kind of help. Sometimes leaders can also use wars to basically, boost their own leadership to basically show their legitimacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to ask, how does that basically deal with the path the path dependency? Because like kind of damage, their legitimacy as, as authoritarian or as a leader, or does it some or have we seen patterns where them starting a war, it maintains their power and does not dismantle their own?
This is a good question, Jeffrey. And the answer is it depends. The critical juncture can go one of two ways, right? Like it can reinforce the strength of the incumbent regime or the state or the actor, or it can weaken it and overturn it. And whether it is weakened or reinforced sort of depends on the performance of that actor in that context or that war, right? So let me give you an example to make this more concrete, because it's very abstract, I know. In 1983, in Argentina, the military dictatorship was in free fall. It was losing popularity and legitimacy because it was performing so badly economically. The economic crisis was really bad. The military leadership decided to try to shore up their support by instigating a war over the Falklands Islands with Great Britain. Now, what would have happened had they won that war? Well, they might have been able to reinforce their authority and their rule, and they might have actually been able to survive in power and sort of endure and sustain and kind of, drag out the dictatorship for another 5 or 6 years or however many. But they didn't. They lost that war. In the loss of that war, really, really shook things up in Argentina. It's dramatically weakened the military. They had to basically run with their tail between their legs back to the barracks. And they scurried back to the barracks. They really did. And they were forced into retreat by their disastrous performance. This is an example of a critical juncture that really, really weakened the incumbent regime. And it gives you a sense of how things can go one of two ways. Had they won that war, they might have been able to hold on to power, but they lost the war. So they weren't able to hold on to power. So it just kind of depends, right? It depends on some of the things that happen, the contingency that takes place in that moment. Critical junctures don't always lead to change. It's possible that the defender of the status quo is able to hold on and stand their ground. So let me take a look at the poll here. Virtually all of us are in, and it's relatively even. I'm going to go ahead and end the poll and share it. It looks like a majority of you, or 50% of you, 26 of you, see yourselves as rational choice institutionalists, inclined to see equilibria and cooperation, and inclined to see humans resolving collective action problems by creating institutions, setting up arrangements to facilitate cooperation and benefit equally from institutions. 12 of you, or 23% of you, see yourselves as sociological institutionalists, inclined to link institutions to sociological norms, and cultural norms, and logics of appropriateness. 14 of you, or 27% of you, see institutions as the result of power relations and ideas at particular moments in time. Now, that's a very interesting mix. It looks like there's a little bit to go around. And I'd imagine that many of you who see yourselves as rational choice institutionalists might also see a little bit of validity to historical institutionalism, and maybe vice versa. I know for example, I'm inclined to gravitate to power relations and ideas as key factors, but I also see there being a clear role for cooperation and consensus and equilibria, and meeting points and coordination. I think that there's a mix of both. And so there's a role for all of these, and we shouldn't limit ourselves. We should imagine that there's a role for a variety of different factors in accounting for the origin of institutions and the survival of institutions. I want you to think liberally and use these perspectives as tools in your toolkit. One perspective might be more useful in one situation than another, and vice versa. We don't need to limit ourselves arbitrarily to one or the other. And as we can continue in the course, you'll notice that all three of them have a lot to say about the different issues that arise in the variation across time and space that comes up when we look at government forms across time and space and in democracy. As you think about what you gravitate to, I'd like you to also think about what you would need to see to believe more strongly or gravitate more strongly in the direction of a different perspective. You know, what kinds of evidence would shore up the role of historical institutionalism if you are a rational choice institutionalist? Or if you are a sociological institutionalist, what kinds of evidence would you need to see to be persuaded that rational choice is a driver of institution creation, and so on and so forth? Let me take a look at the chat here. Yeah, I thought it was a nice plane too. It's like, yeah, I would get on that plane. Maybe only if COVID was over.
Professor, I have another question
Yes, Jeff.
actually. I remember talking last semester in POLI 5, which is basically international relations. I remember talking about power vacuums. So how do you also deal with power vacuums in the sense that, like, where will the power vacuum fit in one of these three institution variations?
Yeah, good question, Jeffrey. So I think it fits squarely under historical institutionalism. And the reason is because historical institutionalism, it pays attention to those power relations and who has the power, so to speak, right? Who has the capacity to affect outcomes. Now, a critical juncture by definition is basically kind of like a power vacuum. It can become a power vacuum if the traditional defenders of the status quo are weakened by the critical juncture or by the events that take place at that critical juncture. And if they're weakened, they often have to concede the ground, the political ground. And what that means is they sort of abdicate the throne, so to speak. And we kind of have like a power vacuum at that moment. And so let me go back to my example from Argentina. In 1983, when the military lost that war, they conceded the ground. They scurried back to the barracks, partly of their own accord, because they had been so thoroughly defeated and humiliated. They were very radically weakened. And when they scurried back to the barracks, they left a gap, an opening, a power vacuum, if you will. And the civilians who had opposed the military regime filled the void. They filled the power vacuum. And they filled the void by commandeering the democratic transition and taking control of the process of transition. So in the situation where a critical juncture weakens the traditional defenders of the status quo, there's very likely to be a power vacuum that results from those defenders of abdicating the throne and sort of absconding and kind of fleeing the scene, so to speak. And so I think that historical institutionalism accounts for the power vacuums pretty well. Rational choice institutionalism doesn't really pay attention to power relations. It instead kind of assumes that actors are relatively equal and even-handed in their capacity to influence outcomes, and it instead focuses on how they set up institutions to facilitate their cooperative exchange in their mutual benefit. In that regard, it doesn't really leave open the possibility that there could be a power vacuum. Instead, it normally treats um, it treats cooperation, instrumentality, and self-interest as the key driver of a willingness to coordinate with others and not impose, which is the logic of historical institutionalism. And then sociological institutionalism, it also doesn't really pay attention to power. It's more concerned with appropriate behavior and what's acceptable from the viewpoint of some broader community or some broader society. And so I think then that historical institutionalism is probably the most useful if we're interested in power vacuums and power relations and how power works. So this does bring us to the main event for this week, which is a discussion of democracy and its institutions. Now, democracy, of course, is the subject of this course, and it's the type of institutions that we focus on. So far, we've focused on political institutions in a general way, and how political institutions can vary across space and time, and what they are, and how to understand their origin and their maintenance, and how they and why they are changed. These are the general tools that we'll use for the rest of the course, and this does set the stage for our understanding of both democracy and the ways that institutions organize democracy. So, because we are essentially out of time, and because we've reached sort of an end point, we'll begin with this topic on Wednesday, and we'll devote Wednesday and Friday to discussing democracy and its institutions. We'll have a clean study of those topics on Wednesday and Friday. This does conclude today's meeting. Thanks so much, everybody, for being here and for participating. I think that we accomplished a lot again, and I always enjoy your input. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but I'll see you on Wednesday, okay?